Hello everyone, and welcome back to Chevain's Bag of Holding. Today, we're going to be discussing Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. This is a big departure from regular D&D. This is definitely a deep dive into the darker side of horror. We're going to discuss multiple realms of horror, character creation, and several other really cool things. So in front of you today, I have the alternate cover. First of all, special thanks to Top Cut Comics in Loves Park, Illinois, for hooking me up with the pre-order on this. This is fantastic artwork. On the front is Monster Hunter Ez Devnir. Got Strahd looking over in the background, a couple of werewolves and ghouls and stuff. Really cool artwork on the cover. Flip side, got some ravens circling around. Probably getting ready to pick clean the bones of unfortunate adventurers. Well, let's dive into the books themselves. So I don't like to open my alt covers. So I do have the regular cover that we're going to dive into today. Regular cover of Ravenloft. Also some really cool artwork. Got Strahd, not too happy with Van Richten and Ez Devnir. Flip side, Strahd's castle in Barovia. Very cool. So, this is broken down into 5 different chapters. First chapter is going to cover character creation. You can create haunted heroes that are formed in the lands, in the domains of dread. You can create lineages for them. You can set your characters up with dark gifts. If you don't want to give them dark gifts right off the bat, you can also set them up with dark bargains. Dark bargains basically is something that the adventurers have to fulfill in order to obtain a dark gift. Dark gifts are pretty cool. We'll check out some of those here in a bit. There's also a couple of new subclass options. You could do a Bard from the College of Spirits or Warlock the Undead. Subclass options are pretty cool. They give you a couple really neat spells and abilities. A little more spice to the characters for Ravenloft. You can also go over horror characteristics and backgrounds, general background features, so on and so forth. They do give you a couple of examples of some backgrounds. A haunted one and an investigator. And then they give you an entire page and a half of new horror trinkets, which are pretty awesome if you check them out. Chapter 2 covers creating domains of dread. There are definitely some pre-made ones in this book. However, it gives you all the tools you need to create your own. Each domain is run by a Dark Lord, which is a powerful entity that is tormented by the Dark Ones. The Dark Ones are basically whatever you want them to be, but they're unseen, really unheard, and they kind of control everything, kind of like gods. So it goes in depth about creating a Dark Lord, creating a domain for that Dark Lord to preside over. And then the coolest feature, I think, is the genres of horror. So they get into a bunch of different ones like body horror, cosmic, dark fantasy, folk horror, ghost stories, and gothic. They go into great detail on those, and then they have another subset on page 57 of some other genres that they don't go into quite as much detail, but it gives you some really good ideas. Chapter 3 goes into the domains of Ravenloft. There's a whole bunch of different pre-made domains that are in here that you can check out. Also, you can see on page 168, it gives you some other domains that it doesn't go into too much detail on, but it gives you the basics. So if you wanted to use one of those for your adventures, you can. Goes into Travelers in the Mist, Mist Wanderers. Get some details on Rudolf Van Richten himself, as well as Ez Devnir. Chapter 4 jumps into a couple of different pre-made horror adventures. It also discusses what to do ahead of time, as well as the aftermath of the horror adventure. Now, like I mentioned, this is really getting into the darker side of D&D, so it's always a good idea to discuss with your players ahead of time kind of what their limits are. You don't want people leaving upset or ready to have nightmares. You want their characters to have nightmares, but not necessarily the players themselves. So it's always a good idea to kind of get a feel for where everybody stands before you start a campaign within Ravenloft. Chapter 5 covers the monsters of Ravenloft. I highly recommend anybody check those out. There's some really scary monsters in there. Some really cool ones. with excellent descriptions, and they have some really crazy, unique abilities. And we'll get to the appendix at the end. That's the spirit board, which we'll discuss in a little more detail later. Let's jump into some of the items within the book. Not going to cover every single thing, but we'll get into a couple of the cool things. So it gives you the basics on Dark Lords themselves. A couple things to realize with Dark Lords is Dark Lords are definitely evil. They are prisoners of their domain. They're always tormented. They hold influence over their domains. They vary in threat. Dark Lords are active. They always take an active role in what's going on in their domain and the people in it. Dark Lords don't necessarily realize that they're Dark Lords, and they are immortal. There's a couple of slight exceptions to that immortal rule, which if you get the book yourself and read in depth, you'll see. I'm not going to spoil it for everybody. Character creation is pretty awesome. Talks about the habits of horror heroes, lineages, languages, ability score increases. Gives you a couple of examples here. So one of the new classes is a Dhampir. Dhampir is a type of vampire. So there's tables for their hungers, their origins, goes over their traits. Next you have a Hexblood. Goes over the Hexblood origins. Then you have a Reborn. That's an interesting one. So they have tables for lost memories and their origins as well. Page 22 here discusses dark gifts and dark bargains, kind of like I alluded to earlier. You can get into some descriptions, some different dark gifts that they have listed here, like Echoing Soul, Gathered Whispers, Living Shadow, Mistwalker, Second Skin, Symbiotic Being. That's one of my favorites. So just as an example, we'll go over a couple of these tables for Symbiotic Being. So Symbiotic Nature, you can roll a d6, and for your character, they might have, if you roll a 1, it's tiny humanoid facial features protruding from your torso, palm, or the back of your head. If you roll a 2, it's an alien appendage inside an unhealing wound. 3 is a burrowing worm-like being somewhere on the character's body. 4, an intrusive thought that inhabits your mind constantly. 5 is a living tattoo. 6 is crystal growths that replace a portion of your body. So just to give you an idea of what kind of horror to expect in Ravenloft, that's just some things that can happen to the character upon character generation. The symbiotic agenda, another D6 table. I'm not going to read them all, but let's say you roll a 2. It's going to say that the symbiote craves knowledge and is determined to solve a mystery or learn a secret. Next one is Touch of Death. We've got Watchers. There's a lot of cool different dark gifts you can have in here with descriptions of each. Then it gets into the subclasses. So we'll just touch on one of them. We'll go into the Bard from the College of Spirits. Again, a couple cool spells. You got Guiding Whispers, Spiritual Focus, and Tales from Beyond. I like Tales from Beyond because if they cast it, then you roll a d12 and pick the item from this table that's going to affect the target. So let's say they roll a 6, Tale of the Traveler. The target gains temporary hit points equal to a roll of your Bardic Inspiration die plus your Bard level. While it has these temporary hit points, the target's walking speed increases by 10 feet, and it gains a +1 to its AC. That's just 1 at 12. So a lot of cool things you can do with a Bard in Ravenloft. Second subclass is Warlock of the Undead. It's also a very cool one. They have some really unique spells in there. And it gets into some backgrounds that you can choose. The Mistwalkers, the Inheritor, the Spirit Medium. Horror characteristics. So you have tables for personality traits, character ideals, character bonds, and character flaws. Gets into some depth and some detail regarding some of these, like the haunted one. Sets you up with a harrowing event for the haunted one, as well as their feature. And here's that big table of trinkets I mentioned. So there's tons of cool horror trinkets. Let's pick a cool one for a description. Let's see here. If you roll a 31, a bouquet of funerary flowers that always looks and smells fresh. A small mirror that shows a much older version of the viewer. So, just a couple of examples of some really neat horror trinkets you can have. Chapter 2 starts out with creating your own domain of dread. Goes into creating a Dark Lord. A couple things to keep in mind is sinister reflections, what to reflect, exaggerated reflections, opposite reflections. Get into their past life. Gives you a list of questions to consider when you're coming up with your Dark Lord's past life. Personality. Each Dark Lord has a fatal flaw, so there's a table for fatal flaws there. Corrupt beyond redemption, so it gives you a couple of different ideas there for corruptions. Talks about developing a Dark Lord, their monstrous transformation, what do they turn into? So there is a cool table for that if you want to use it. Birth of a Dark Lord. This is one of the coolest parts, I think, of Ravenloft. So let's say you're a DM and your adventurers, your party, kills off one of your favorite evil NPCs and you really miss them. You can bring him back as a Dark Lord in charge of his own domain of dread. Next, it gets into creating a domain. Gives you a bunch of lists of Endless Torment, domain overview, cultural specifics, monsters, misty borders, and adventures. Gives you some tables here for Dark Lord connections and Dark Lord interactions. My next favorite part of this book is the genres of horror. So on page 45, here's where that starts. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the first one in here is body horror. So body horror as a genre examines a universal fear, our own failing anatomies. We rarely think about what goes on beneath our skin. Gives a nice table here, a list of some monsters to use for body horror campaigns. There's a table here for villains, which is pretty cool. An example there would be number 3, a seething mass of fungi that grows more intelligent with every sapient life it engulfs. Pretty cool stuff. It's a table for body horror torments, body horror settings, adventure sites, and plots. So really gives you the whole 9 yards, depending on what genre you want to do. Let's skip through the rest of these. Domains of Ravenloft. This is where it gets into some of the different domains, some of the featured domains that are in here. First one listed is Barovia. Barovia is the home of Strahd von Zarovich, the vampire. So it tells you who the Dark Lord is, what horror genre it is, the hallmarks for that domain, as well as mist talismans. Gives you a list of noteworthy features, settlements, and sites, such as Castle Ravenloft. Gives you some details regarding Strahd himself. Talks about Strahd's power and dominion. Tips on how to roleplay Strahd. And tips for creating adventures in Barovia. Next, it gets into incarnations of Tatiana. Tatiana is Strahd's downfall. It is his former wife who is no longer with us, and he cannot find her, and he is always looking for her. So that's really the plot hook for anything Strahd related in Barovia. A couple other ones is Blue at Spur. Each domain has its own Dark Lord, Borka. A couple of really cool ones. So they give you some prepackaged ones with a lot of information on them. Towards the end of this chapter, it gets into some of the other domains that it doesn't have as many details on, but it does give you some basics, so you can kind of flesh out the rest on your own. Chapter 4 gets into horror adventures. So this is where the book discusses preparing, understanding it, setting expectations, maybe doing a survey for your players to see what their limits are. Gets into gameplay questions, setting up boundaries, reinforcing expectations. The pacing, gameplay itself, a lot of cool things. Then towards the end of that chapter, it gets to after the horror, like wrap up, things like that. There are a couple of extras that you can get with Ravenloft. One is a Tarokka deck and a spirit board. I don't have the Tarokka deck yet. It is in the Curse of Strahd revamped automatically. Otherwise, the Tarokka deck is sold separately. But it does come with the spirit board on the very last couple pages in here. Spirit board is basically like a Ouija board, but it's set up a little bit different. This is the template for it, if you can see that. Looks very similar to the one that's on a Ouija board. But it does give some details on how to use the Tarokka deck. Now, the Tarokka deck was introduced all the way back in 1983 in the Adventure Ravenloft, and also the Curse of Strahd from 2016. It contains 54 tarot-like cards, fortune-telling cards, each one bearing one of the following symbols. So you have crowns, coins, glyphs, stars, and swords. The Tarokka deck lets you run encounters where fortune tellers predict the character's fates. It gives you an idea of what that is. Spirit board is a tool to contact and divine the will of spirits or other mysterious forces. Very similar to a Ouija board. Another cool thing about the Ravenloft book is the horror toolkit. It discusses curses. So how to lay them, how to lay curses, different components of a curse. There's a couple samples of curses. Ancient Seal. This curse protects the resting place of a long-dead ruler and punishes any who disturb the ruler's remains or plunder the treasures. So it goes over the pronouncement for it, the burden, the resolution. A couple other curses: broken vow, final breath, and innocent blood. Fear and stress are a big part of horror. There's a thing in this campaign called Seeds of Fear, where if your party encounters a seed of fear, they'll have to roll on this D12 table to see what they're afraid of. This really aids in role-playing. For example, number 5, I hate being stuck in tight spaces. So if you throw your party into a tight space, it gives a great opportunity for your party to, at least that character, to role-play that. And you can award inspiration based on good role-playing based on their seeds of fear. Gets into stress and reducing stress. Being scared constantly, I can imagine, is pretty stressful, so it does start to adversely affect the characters. Next, it goes into haunted traps, which is really cool. Gets into detecting, disarming, gives you a couple of samples of haunted traps. I love traps. You can set up special NPCs called survivors, right? Survivors, they survive some kind of horrific experience, and they basically are a wealth of information regarding maybe a specific adventure that's coming up. Talks all about creating them and how to role play them, things like that. Talents gives you a couple of stat blocks for different survivors you might want to create. Then it gets into a couple of the adventures themselves. So there's the House of Lament. Gives you some maps for those. A lot of good information. Some short adventures, but they give you a good idea of what you can do to create some good ones yourselves. Chapter 5 gets into all the monsters. Tons of cool monsters, as you can imagine. It also assists in creating unique nightmares and monstrous minions on your own. Gives you some stat blocks for a lot of the ones that they already have in here. Getting past the monsters, we will get to the spirit board. So this is what that spirit board looks like. Like I mentioned, it looks very similar to a Ouija board. Let's hold this up so you can get a better view. Got all the letters of the alphabet, 0 through 9, a yes and a no, greetings and farewell. So a cool little addition that you can use for your campaign in Ravenloft if you wanted to. Well, that's Ravenloft in a nutshell. Hopefully you liked the presentation. For more information on Top Cut Comics, please check out their website, www.topcutcentral.com. They're located at 5600 North 2nd Street in Loves Park, Illinois. Cool thing about Top Cut is any purchase you make, they give you this little punch card, right? Every $10 you spend, you get a punch. And once you get a full punch card, you get $10 off your next purchase. So go check them out, guys. They're a lot of fun. They hook me up regularly with the pre-orders. They're a great group of people to work with. As always, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please give me a like. If you really liked it, please subscribe. Look forward to seeing you